Now, tonight, we're fortunate to have our speaker, Bill Burton. Bill is the publisher of a website called postcardhistory.net. And he works pretty hard at it because every week they come out with 4 new articles about postcards. It's a very, very good website, and you can go to the website and you can opt into the mailing list so you get notified when the new articles come out. Bill began collecting postcards of Ossining, New York, which is where he lived at the time. That's in the Hudson Valley in New York State. And then his collection expanded over the years to include his college and neighboring towns and places where he and his wife traveled. In retirement, he's focused on Delaware and the Delmar, Virginia Peninsula towns. He says he's just as likely to be found parked in front of the 25-cent boxes at shows there with Rick. And his profession is in the printing industry. And tonight he's going to talk about printers that years ago printed postcards. So Bill, take it away.
Okay, thanks very much, Michael. It turns out that with the website postcardhistory.net, Ray Hahn, who's the editor, and came up with the idea that our mantra should be, there's a story behind every postcard. And it's true, but it usually is taken to mean there's a story behind the image that's on every postcard. But there's another way of looking at it, and that's that the story behind the postcard is the story behind the making of the postcard. And that story has 2 parts to it. It has the publisher and it has the printer. So here's the distinction, and it may be pretty obvious to a lot of people, but it's not when you get into common discussion. The publisher is the person or company that determines what the images are that are going to go on the cards. The publisher assumes the financial risk for printing the cards, and the publisher arranges to distribute the cards and sell the cards. The printer, on the other hand, makes a substantial investment in the presses, the buildings, the employees, and all of that sort of thing, because the printer is in the business of making lots more than just the postcards that the publisher may want to do. The second thing that the printer does is that he solicits work from the publishers, because if he sits around and waits for the publishers to show up, he'll go out of business pretty quickly. So they usually employ sales representatives, people who work in production, shipping, cutting up the cards, all of that. And finally, the printer delivers the finished cards to the publisher. Now that's all a big deal, because if any part of that breaks down, you wouldn't have any postcards, is really what it amounts to. Now this is a picture of Kurt Tyke in 1895, when he was only 18, and he had barely arrived in the United States. He was an immigrant with a family that was already established in the printing business in Chicago. But when he came, he did not have any connections in the world at all. So the question of how he would get to into the industry was very important. Most of the cards that were printed in the days that we consider to be the pioneer era were local black and white cards that were produced by, in most cases, local printers. And of course, all real photo cards were done the same way. But I bring that part up because on a lot of sites, you see where there's a statement that says, this card was published by, let's say, Albertite, referring to the text on the divider on the back of the card. That's not necessarily true. And in fact, in the case of Albertite, it isn't really true at all. They published very few cards themselves. They were true printers. They printed the cards, and they were then distributed by the people who paid for them. Now, we customarily date the origin of the American colored postcard to the Chicago World's Fair of 1893. That's more or less true, except that the cards that were handed out or sold were not postcards. They were souvenir cards. As an article a couple of months ago in Postcard History showed, they were printed on the blank backs of government postcards. There was no reason to think of them as original postcards, to say an original front and a back. But in that sense, you had the pioneer card era beginning at that point. And that era is, as we know, 1893 to 1898. And we saw the beginning of the focus on postcards with the back of this card, the blank side, the address, the side opposite the address, with a particular image that was put there deliberately. Privately printed cards, you could do that, but you had to pay 2 cents postage versus 1 cent if you did it the old way of printing them on a 1 cent card from the government. But the floodgates opened for privately printed postcards on May 19th, 1898, when Congress allowed private mailing cards to go through the mail for a penny. And now the race was on. The earliest postmarked card that I have in my collection is postmarked October 24th, 1898, and states that it was published by Illustrated Postcard Company, 118 Chambers Street, New York. As this card shows an image of a local bank and a local Civil War monument in Ossining, New York, it's frankly unlikely that this big New York City company really is the publisher. So my simple construction of the split between the publisher and the printer doesn't really hold up. We'll probably never know who was the person who arranged for this card to be made, and there's probably no way to find out who provided the picture. But now we get to Kurt Tyke, who had arrived in, as I say, in the early 1890s. At this point, we begin to notice the picture postcards in the later era of the 1890s. And the story of Kurt Tyke is really emblematic. And I tell this or retell it because many of you know about it. And the reason I do that is because there is really no history of most of the other postcard publishers around, nowhere near the depth that Kurt Tyke has. So in the years after the Civil War, many talented Germans immigrated to the United States and established printing businesses of their own. The technology of stone lithography, which is the way that the German printing industry had worked in the past, in the old country was not really available in this country. So these German printers adapted a variety of the newer what are called chromolithographic presses, which is to say that, like that picture that I had at the front of the talk, very different from stone printing lithography. Tyke's family had gradually immigrated from Germany in the 1880s, and they brought with them the secrets of German printing, because at the time, it was forbidden by German law to make the technical transfer of closely held secrets. When Tyke arrived from Germany in 1895, he was apprenticed to a New York commercial printer, and in that shop, but within 3 years, he skipped out and went to Chicago to join the family business. He was a tinkerer. He was always looking to figure out how to do something new, make things improve. He went back to Germany in 1904 and ran into the fad for picture postcards. When he returned to the United States, so the story goes, in 1905, he traveled on the train down to Florida from Chicago. And then 2000, then turned essentially west and spent another 2,000 miles going all the way to California. Every time the train stopped, he would get off, take his camera, and take pictures of the local buildings, the main street, all of the things that people were proud of in the town. And he would offer to print cards of those things for people for the local drugstore or the newspaper to sell. And it turns out that they say that when he came back to Chicago, he had an order book filled with $30,000 worth of orders for cards. That, in today's money, is essentially $1 million, which is pretty impressive. Most presses at the time couldn't print large sheets of cards, so it was going to be a real project to produce these cards. But Tyke had found a New York manufacturer whose machines could print substantially larger sheets and in color. The resulting ability to print large quantities of cards and the quantity and the quality of the printing gave him a considerable cost advantage, and it really launched the picture postcard printing business for the family printing firm. Now, he was certainly not the first person to print color pictures or color postcards, and certainly not in Germany. The German immigrant printers, however, who had come before and who came after him, went into the business as well. The industry was highly competitive, not only domestically, but with Germany as well. In fact, the German companies established American offices to solicit orders. And this is a card from the Rotograph Company, a German company. And you'll notice where it says represented by Johannes Dietzen. This was a card, the blank back. It was basically just a promotional card that the Mr. Dietzen would give to people who would, when he would go and call on them. And that was the whole point of this, that they were selling, Tyke was selling, the other printers were selling, and it was a really competitive business. As the American industry grew, the domestic industry began to feel the pressure of the German competition, and they banded together to try to strangle the overseas competitors. We tend to think that the German cards that were being sold in those days were superior to those printed in the United States, and I'm personally not going to say that that wasn't true. But the American printers argued that the German cards were undercutting American enterprise. The German cards were taking jobs away from good Americans. And besides, the Germans are foreigners. You have to remember that even at this period of time, the Germans were considered not only foreigners, but suspect. And this made it rather dodgy to be overtly German. And as a consequence, this was a lever that was applied against the German printers. As early as the McKinley Tariff in 1890, for example, duties on imported goods that were made in Germany had applied to them a requirement that they state what the national origin of the printed material was. Just like today, we require people to say made in China or made in Mexico. It was an attempt to reduce competition in favor of the domestic industry. The clincher, though, came in 1909 when the Payne-Aldrich tariff was proposed. President Taft had submitted to Congress a tariff that we would now consider to be a free trade tariff, because the United States was building up so much of a surplus that he felt that you could reduce the tariff and make America competitive. When the sausage grinder in Congress finished with it, it had turned out to be a huge protectionist tariff, and that affirmed not only the national origin rules, you had to say made in Germany, for example, it also added extra duties on foreign printing. Payne-Aldrich was just too much. And as a consequence, the people who distributed foreign cards saw the writing on the wall, and they decided that they were going to get rid of as much of their surplus cards that they could, and they just printed and printed and printed and shipped them over to this country. They went into overdrive and printed millions of cards. And as a consequence, as you can imagine, when there's a glut, the prices go down. When the prices go down, everybody's prices go down, not just the German cards, but the American cards as well. That's where the crash of the printing industry for picture postcards in this country came to be. What was left of the German trade was strangled with the onset of the British blockade of Germany during the beginning of the First World War in 1914. At the time, it was estimated that overseas printers, mostly German, but British and others as well, had produced 75% of all the colored postcards sold in the United States. But even with that, the elimination of the overseas trade, type was still just one of many American postcard printers, and the industry was still highly competitive. So recovering from that crash didn't really necessarily do anything great for type. But over the years, type produced a great many promotional ephemera, which was intended to keep the company's name and its services in front of the customers, or would-be customers anyway. They employed commissioned representatives like rotograph and all sorts of other techniques. For example, this is a card that was sent out to people who were already on Type's mailing list from a sales representative. This is what they call a will call card. I will call on you. Fill in the blank, fill in the blank. Type also put out a general promotional card, and you'll see the listing of 8 of the areas in which they print cards: art color tone, photo varicolor, photo cut, photo color art, type American art, type blue sky, type photo platen, type photo finish. You've probably seen a lot of those kinds of cards, or at least the names, in on cards that you either bought or passed through. Tyke also did direct mail advertising, and he would send this card out to prospective customers and said, and say essentially, tell us what you want. We can do all sorts of things. For example, not just illustrated postcards, but advertising inserts, envelopes, letterheads, all of those things. When the cards would come back, they would be distributed to the representatives, and the representatives would go out and solicit business. This was Tyke's factory in Chicago. It's the last of several factories that they had. It's huge. It's an enormous block, 5 stories, heavy floor weight, and unfortunately susceptible to fire. Now, Tyke didn't have one, because we know that because so many of the company's files survived and went to the Lake County, and now ultimately to the library in Chicago. But other companies did, and some of them were totally destroyed by fire. This card, though, shows the Tyke Chicago factory, and look at the back on the upper back. You see the railroad train? He had his own railroad siding, so that huge amounts of paper could come in, cars could go out, you could bring in a new press, all that sort of thing was really important. And if you look at the bottom of the card, you'll see those 2 white rectangles. This card was apparently in a filing cabinet, and for security reasons, the librarians would punch these holes in there and then slide rods through them to make sure that nobody stole the card. Now, my personal collection of factories that printed postcards is pretty slim, actually. I've only got about 9 or 10 different factories. There are many more. I just haven't found them in a way that I could either pay for or even know that they were postcards, or even that they were a postcard printing.
Hey, Bill?
Yes,
Did
sir.
you know, I just looked up online, that building there that you're showing now,
Yep.
today they call it Postcard Place. It's got apartments and stuff in it, lots.
Do they really?
It's called
It's been
Postcard Place.
converted
Yeah.
to loss?
Yeah.
That's terrific.
Isn't that funny?
The competition was pretty serious. This is a printer in, I'm not sure where he is. I think it's Chicago. You saw that on the back of the card here, up at the top, it says the largest postcard factory in the world, the very top of the white border. You look at Holtzman's card and it says largest establishment in the United States devoted exclusively to the manufacture of postcards. So a little swipe like that was pretty substantial. But you can see that this is not a 5-story building, it's a 2-story building. But there is still a railroad siding for it. Holtzman was like Tyke, he was a German immigrant. There are several versions of this card, although the variations for the most part have to do with where the description is printed in the image. This particular card's back, though, is a response card for placing an order. If you placed an order, you were going to get a confirmation back, and that's what this card was all about. The firm was also known for its Hold the Light cards. And when the collapse of the industry happened after the Payne-Aldrich tariff came in, Holtzman closed its doors in 1910 after having only been in business for 4 years. This was a cutthroat industry. This is a postcard publisher by the name of Art Manufacturing Company. It started out in a town called Amelia, Ohio, in 1898, or more or less. They wanted a bigger building, so they decided rather than build in Amelia, they would do it in Zanesville, Ohio. The company printed a lot of cards in various series, including many embossed and double width cards. And it ultimately closed in 1915. But while they were at it, they published this little card. All is well. Apparently there may have been some resistance, either from the people in Zanesville or from the people in Amelia. But they put this out, and probably, I think, maybe just to tweak the Amelia people about the company's move to Zanesville. In the East Coast, there was a man named Thomas Dexter, and you've probably seen a lot of Dexter's chrome cards. He began his printing career in as a small-time job printer, a guy who would print anything you want, tickets to football games, whatever you wanted, in a small plant in New Jersey. But he was an entrepreneur, and things grew. And this was his plant in New York. In the 30s, he moved from the New Jersey plant to Pearl River, New York, and he began printing cards in several forms. By the 50s, he'd shifted entirely to printing chrome postcards. And he'd moved once again, this time to West Nyack, which is where this plant is. Most of his cards carried the tagline, "Genuine Natural Color." In 1972, Dexter, who was getting on in years, sold the company during that great period of time that they called the conglomerate years, where the companies were buying disparate companies that they had no connection with. They're just buying them for their market share. And he sold out to Consolidated Foods. Company ended its time in 1992 when they became part of another conglomerate called MWM Dexter. And that company's productions files were happily enough staved but sold off to a bunch of postcard dealers who have begun to bring out information about these cards, how to number them, how to understand what the numbering process was. And one of those people is a woman named Diane Allman, who has written an article for Postcard History, which will be published in the next couple of weeks, helping you to decode the cards from 1952 on to know when the card was produced. So watch for it as an article in Postcard History.
Hey,
The
Bill.
Albertype Company.
Hey, Bill.
Yes, sir.
Their code runs, the numbers run from A to D, and I think it's 1 million cards per number. I spent a summer up there one time looking at all of the view cards in the morgue. They had a morgue, and they let me pick 2 of any cards that I wanted. And on one side was the view cards, and on the other side was all of their advertising cards, which I never got to see the advertising cards, but I did manage to extract a small collection out of the parent file. I have a child from the parent file.
Well, I think you'll like Diane's Allman's article. I don't know whether any of you remember Diane Allman. She was the first editor of Postcard Collector from 1983 to 1988. She's now does business on eBay as the Queen of Chrome. She has in excess of 1 million of Dexter's cards, and she has made a second career out of analyzing these numbers of the whole system. It's a pretty amazing story. Albertype was created in the 1880s by 2 brothers, the Whitman brothers from Germany. They had a business printing, of course, in New York City. The company got really going seriously in the postcard business in the 1890s. And the company expanded beyond their initial base of view cards and into comic cards, for example, booklets, colored cards of all sorts, hand-colored cards, and very large view cards. Now, I've got a couple of their very large view cards that are almost 8 by 6 that they produced for the Hudson River Dayline people going up the Hudson River. They're quite beautiful. They're hand colored, and they're view cards in a way that this particular view card of their factory was not. Their printing process was different. They produced their cards in a process called collotype. Collotype is essentially a light-sensitive gelatin, which on exposure to light hardens. And if you expose the gelatin through a negative of a photo, you get the result is a printing surface. The problem with that is that the gelatin can't stand a press run of 20,000. It can stand a press run of a couple of thousand before it begins to degenerate. But collotype captures incredible detail. And you'll find Albertype cards that are very, very precise, as opposed to some of the others that have been either drawn or reproduced from other ways, like duotones. Albertype, unfortunately, never numbered its cards, so it's really tough to get a priority as to what when the cards were made. There's a fellow whose name I don't recall offhand, who is trying to develop a system of looking at the backs of the cards and seeing where the Albertype logo or comment is. And so the earliest cards apparently were it says the Albertype Company in the stamp box. And then there are a couple of other variations on the back, and then what we all know as the standard Albertype things, which is the vertical dividing line that says Postcards, the finest American-made view postcards slogan. That was the one that they finally wound up with. That picture that I just showed you has on the back, this is the back of that card. and they say, "We have rebuilt the old Bridge Street Church and the adjoining building, making them suitable for our manufacturing process." They say it's located near Borough Hall in Brooklyn, and is 100 by 100 feet. So 10,000 square foot area isn't huge by these standards by any means. But they're very proud of the fact that they had preserved this building and were using it for a new purpose. And they invite you people to come in. The problem is that you see the address 309-313 Bridge Street in Brooklyn. I don't think they were ever there. Everything I can find in the directories of businesses in New York City puts Albertype at a street in Brooklyn called Adams Street, either at 205, 250, or 260 Adams Street. I have no idea whether this was maybe something that they were going to do and never did, or just what. But you see the vertical line there, which says, which indicates that this is a later version of the Albertype company's publishing. So I don't know the answer to that. Unfortunately, I do know that the church isn't at 309, 313 Bridge Street. It was long since demolished and been taken over by one of the colleges in New York City. And the company is no longer there either. But this is a card that the salesman would have handed out. And you can see that it's 1910, of course. The card indicates that the company had developed the collotype process, where it says gelatin cards on the left side. That's the collotype process. Albertype renamed the process the Albertype process, but it's the same thing. It was invented in 1855, but it was perfected over time. And look at their prices. I mean, that's for those are pretty competitive prices in the day, and the shipping time 2 to 3 weeks. They'll also retouch your image, your artwork, although they won't create new artwork for you without charging you. And you can. This is just again is an example of the competitiveness of the industry. Hugh C. Latham was a publisher of postcards located in Portland, Maine. And his cards also say printed in Germany. So that national origin rule in the McKinley tariff is plainly there. There's a question, however, as to where Latham printed his cards, because he says that they are printed in Portland, Maine, and then it says printed in Germany. If you see down at the bottom on the left, it says factory of the Hugh C. Layton Company, Portland, Maine, USA. But it's not. This is a German card. This is a German image. So I've never been able to understand what this is all about. Is this a German company that just used Latham's name, or was it an American company that had a German factory and they just didn't want to have to pay the tariffs? I'm not sure. But here's the part that makes it kind of interesting. This is what Latham would put on the back of his cards. Hugh Latham Company manufactures Portland, Maine, printed in Germany. That's essentially a contradiction. One explanation that I've heard is that to be able to claim that he was an American printer, the company took cards from Germany and hand colored them, which made them American made. I don't know. I've never been able to verify it. A couple of years ago, my wife and I went up to Portland on a summer trip, and I went into the Historical Society and asked them where the Latham printing factory was. And they looked around and couldn't find anything. It was not in any business directories or anything. So I don't know how this worked out. Latham didn't last long. He merged with Valentine and Sons, and so you'll see Valentine and Sons Latham cards. The merger was in 1909, and the merged company closed in 1914. So that was the 5 years of the Latham Valentine company. This is a card of a Philadelphia printing company called Chilton, which I always thought was a textbook publisher. I had no idea they printed postcards. It was founded in 1896 and was really a magazine publisher. Their bestseller was something called Cycle Trade Journal, as in bicycle. In 1899, they changed the title to Cycle and Automobile Trade Journal, and evolved into publishing all sorts of international and trade magazines and books as well. Their flagship magazine was called Iron Age, and you can see it's a one-story building with the skylights across the top, and that's probably where was their printing floor. That's the printing floor. As you can see, the presses and everything being stacked up. And I'm not sure whether you can read it, but it says the Daylight plant of the Chilton Company, Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, largest manufacturers of high-grade colored advertising postcards in America. That's what they did. That's the kind of postcards they did. Direct mail, colored advertising cards, not view cards or topics that we're used to. But here is their sales list. They kept a large stock of generic cards, and you could have them imprint on those cards anything you wanted. So if you, I mean, just to make something up, if you were a florist and they had a card that showed a bundle of a bunch of roses, you could say immediately available from the XYZ florist in downtown Dover, Delaware, to give an example, and you could send them out. So they made a good deal of money doing that. And again, look at their prices. $7 per thousand for 1,000 cards, pre-printed already. That's how competitive the business was. But you can see again, it's the same image that I showed you earlier of the one-story plant with the daylighting skylights on it. And finally, this was a card that frankly drives me nuts, because E.C. Kropp of Milwaukee, when I published this article in Postcard History about a year ago, I got a comment that said, you know, E.C. Kropp was one of the really big competitors to Type. I cannot find a thing on the internet that gives me any sort of history of this company. I have found out that Mr. Kropp used the chromolithographic process, and that he was in business from 1898. He moved into a broader range of postcards in 1907, and the company changed its name from just Kropp to E.C. Kropp. Unlike many of his competitors, though, Kropp's diversity held up enough so that he could get through the times when the tariffs hit. And he diversified into some, I wouldn't call them dodgy, but something less than nice cards. He did a lot of racist Southern cards, cotton picking and all of that sort of thing. And he got into sports cards. So he weathered World War I and continued on in business until he merged the company in 1956. But again, I cannot find a history even close to competitive with the Type story. So I'm really at a loss as to what the real story is with him. These kinds of cards are difficult to find. You find factory cards in most dealers' bins, but you have to go through them very carefully to even know what they made, unless they said, well, this is a milk factory or this is a steel factory. But if you look at the factories, 1 or 2 story, fairly large, but you don't know the names of them, it's a real hunt. It's a real grail quest. I enjoy it, but I must say that it drives me a little nuts. So, as I say, this is my story. I'm sticking to it, and I appreciate your attention.
Thank you. Thank you very much. Anybody have
Thanks,
any
Mike.
questions?
I know a collector in the Hudson River Valley who had a student of his who helped clean out the Dexter plant.
Oh, really?
And this person was able, they threw millions of postcards away. They had, I can't remember how many dumpsters there.
Mm-hmm.
And she got piles of postcards. But her job was to just pick up piles of these and take them outdoors and throw them in the dumpsters.
Oh,
And she said he told him that they were huge dumpsters and they were filled right to the top, and they had to put netting on the top
Oh,
so they wouldn't fly out when the truck came and picked them up.
well, that's what's so exciting about what Diane Allman was able to accomplish. She got the business records, the production records, really, of the company. I know another dealer who I think has probably passed away now, because I haven't heard from her in a number of years. She was able to get at least some of the artwork for the cards. And she sold me 2 Ossining-based photographs, which had been used as the basis of cards. And I've never found a card that was made from any of this artwork at all. So it has to be out there somewhere, but I've never found it. But all of this is the history of Dexter probably is around, and it will come out sometime, the next 20 years. But right now, it's only beginning to be told.
They also did some linen cards, but not particularly good quality.
Yeah, I think he was, Kyle. I think he was really a chrome card printer, and he did a lot of job work. If another company needed something done faster than they could produce it, they give it to him to do. He was a very sharp guy, and the fact that he kept it going as long as he did as Dexter is pretty impressive. I mean, from the 20s up to 1976 when he sold it, that's a pretty good run.
We have a company here in Rochester. It's actually a small printer, but they publish postcards, just current day postcards of different tourist type things around the area.
Uh-huh.
And they print their own and they sell them to different tourist attractions. They're sold at Wegmans, grocery stores. They're sold at I think in the thruway rest areas and things like that. So that's
if you search Google for the term postcards, the first 12 hits you're going to get are ads for people who print postcards. Big companies, national companies. You send them the image as a PDF, and in a week they'll send it back.
right. But this company actually takes the pictures, they publish them,
Yes.
sell them. They're
Oh,
both
that's
published.
great.
Yeah.
So they're a throwback to the old days of
Yeah.
producing local cards.
Yeah, Edwards Press. They also
Wow.
do puzzles, and what else they do, Rick? He came and spoke to our club a couple of years ago. But yeah, the postcards, and they still do them to this day.
There are people who take old postcards of their town and figure out exactly where the camera was, how high off the ground, exactly where it was angled. And then they snap the picture of what the site looks like today, and they publish them as cards then and now. And that's kind of neat too, because that takes a lot of work to get it just right.
I like to look for postcards. I call them, would you go here from this postcard?
Uh-huh.
And a lot of them Dexter Press cards, and the original image is blurred or a horrible photograph.
Really?
I mean, the classic one is this awful looking mud hole in Iowa. It claims to be the best swimming hole in Iowa, but it's I guess you could say it's out of registration or it's out of focus. So I guess Dexter, if that was the slide, or the color, I'm assuming it was an Ektachrome or Kodachrome slide they were sent. I mean,
I don't know. It's possible that it was a comic card.
I think it was a serious card. It was
I think
put
it
out
was
by
a serious card.
It
Wow.
was put out by the Chamber of Commerce of this town, trying to lure people to the benefits of wallowing in bovine fecal saturated mud, I guess. And I was just wondering, would Dexter look at this, the company look at this card and say, well, maybe you ought to send us a better image?
Yeah, when
I
it
mean-
came in, or even when it went out, somebody must have looked at it from the quality control department and say, oh, this is not something we want to put our name on.
I'm tempted to look at a copy I have of Don Preciosi's book called Boring Postcards to see who published each of the cards. It's an old timer book.
That's the book that's published by Theoden.
I can't remember. It's been
It's
it's
a small-
at the
Faden,
bottom
yes.
of the pile.
Small.
Yeah.
That's a wonderful, and none of those postcards are boring either. They're all wonderful, wonderful, wonderful postcards.
Well, you
Every
know
one
a
of them.
Facebook page called Tacky Postcards? If you're not on Facebook, you can't see it, but it's Wally Young is sort of the semi-proprietor of it, and they publish 2 or 3 cards a day that are just beyond tasteless or stupid or whatever, and they're hilarious.
So I take it the company would not kind of try to help the client, the publisher. I mean, I guess
Well,
they, since they grab.
I don't know, if I
so
were the
much-
proprietor of the company, I don't think unless they told me this is exactly what they wanted, I don't think I'd produce it that way.
I'm not sure.
And I
I'd
might
put my
even
name-
take my name off the card. I don't
Yeah.
know.
Bill, Dexter had retouchers to bring in photos of water from out west and also from skies. And I think they numbered the clouds
Really?
in some of the cards.
They put numbers in the
Well,
clouds?
no, there was a numbered clouds, like if you wanted 1 cloud, 2 clouds, 3
Oh,
clouds,
I see.
multi-clouds.
And you paid by the cloud?
I don't know what the pricing was per cloud,
Wow.
but it was it was a very interesting place in terms of the way they had it designed in the morgue with the files, the filing system. And I spent a whole summer up there going through the view cards, on
Wow.
one side of the file, which ran the length of the building. I mean, it was like incredible. It took me so long, but I've seen every main street and back road in America. But they had some really great cards too, like the baseball cards, Mickey Mantle and Whitey Ford. And I don't know, you just ran across like really interesting things up there.
Uh-huh. Well, Dexter really was he obviously wasn't the first person to do chrome cards, but he really staked out a position in the field as the go-to guy for quick turnaround and high quality chrome cards. Muddy cards would be the exception, I would think.
I just found this really interesting because I figured Kodak must have printed postcards. And you probably all know this, but I'm new to postcards, you know that. But this little paragraph says that Kodak had a postcard camera, which was discontinued in 1943. And did you know that? They made it, they had a postcard camera.
They made cameras for real photo cards. They made kits, in fact.
Hmm.
I didn't know they went on that long.
Well,
But you could buy a kit that would include the paper, which was photosensitive on one side and had a printed back on it.
Hmm.
And you could buy the chemicals, and
Mhm.
a lot of the real photo postcard people would go out to state fairs in the summer and things like that, offer to take a picture of you in front of the tent, and 20 minutes later they'd give you 5 cards of that picture. And they must have had a camera that would work well for that, but I have no idea that they would go into the 40s still doing that.
Yeah, it said that they discontinued it in 1943. And it
Wow.
goes on, this little paragraph goes on to say that in 1907, Kodak introduced a service called Real Photo Postcards,
Yep.
which enabled customers to make a postcard from any picture they took. Similarly, in 1902, Eastman Kodak began selling silver chloride photo paper with a pre-printed postcard back.
Yep.
So you probably all knew that, but it's new to me. And I find it
I
interesting.
had no idea that they kept going for 40 years on that.
Does
That's
it say
amazing.
what the name of that was it A something, the camera, A9 or A7 or something?
It does not say.
Yeah, the
Well,
camera was,
this paragraph doesn't say.
it did images to the right size of postcards. They were very popular, those cameras back in the day.
You could probably find out, I think the George Eastman House got the Patton Museum collection of Eastman Kodak when Kodak, I guess, started when they were really in rough shape about 10 or 15 years ago.
Uh-huh.
And they have, I think, everything. And if they don't have it, the Kodak Patton collection in the United Kingdom would have it.
Wow.
All right, well, thank you very much, Bill. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Very
Thank
good.
you.
And thank
Thank
you
you so
everybody
This
for
was fun. I'm glad I had the
Thank you.
chance to do this.
being here. Now, we don't have a meeting next month because it's our postcard show month. But we do have the show on Sunday, the 10th, and then we'll be back to meetings in November. Well, thank you, everybody.